Hello, everyone. And I'd just like to say a few words before we start this event. So, about a week ago, when I wrote a story introducing the event, I asked, what do the two words climate change mean to you? And I have to confess that over the past 4 years, I've actually struggled with how to answer that question myself. And during those 4 years, I've reported on climate change from Washington, D.C., from Fort McMurray, from Hartley Bay on BC's north coast, from Beijing, from many places, and I've read a truly uncountable number of stories on climate change. So I began to see certain frames or narratives repeat over and over again. And one of the narratives that I started to see all the time was something called a conflict narrative, or what I would call a conflict narrative. And in its most basic form, you have Group A in society trying to stop Company B or Government C from doing something bad. And there's nothing wrong with this frame. There's nothing incorrect about it. I've used it many times in my own writing, and it's a useful way to understand hugely complex issues like the Northern Gateway pipeline. But I began to notice certain limits with this frame as well. And one of them is that it concentrates control over our planet's destiny in the hands of only a few corporate or political elites. And what I mean by this is that what I mean by this is that this frame reinforces an idea that in order to create change in society, we have to defeat those corporate or business elites or force their hand in some way. And as we've seen with the Northern Gateway pipeline and Keystone XL, progress in that regard can be quite slow. And so after reading these stories over and over again, I began to feel a sense of stalemate or deadlock. And so the other narrative that I started seeing all the time was something I'll call transition narrative. And so this basically acknowledges that our culture's transition away from a carbon-heavy civilization has been going on for quite some time, and it's beginning to manifest in pretty significant ways. So you see electric car sales going up. You see the price of renewable energy coming down. You see Google this month purchasing Nest Labs for $3.2 billion. And like the conflict narrative, there's nothing wrong with this one either. It's quite useful. I wish we spent more time in the media and as a society talking about solutions. But it has its limits as well, and the major limit of the transition narrative is that it portrays climate change as a narrow environmental issue comparable to deforestation, for instance, or acid rain that can simply be solved with the right technology or policies. And I came to understand climate change as something much bigger, something that was literally impacting all of human existence. And in trying to figure out how to conceive of climate change, I found it useful to compare it to another broad cultural phenomenon that has many similar qualities, and that is the internet. Like climate change, it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It simultaneously connects the actions of billions of people across the planet. One major difference is that nobody denies that the internet exists. However, in many ways, it's just as intangible as climate change. You can't touch it, you can't see it, you can't hear it, but it's completely changing the way we create technology, do business, run politics, and relate to our external environment, the same way that climate change is. And so that's why we decided to assemble 4 of Vancouver's leading environmental thinkers here tonight to discuss the ways that climate change is fundamentally altering the culture that we live in, and to provide you glimpses into an uncertain but not entirely unforeseeable future that we're all creating together. And so I'll just spend a couple moments introducing the speakers. First up, we'll have Jim Hoggan, who's president of Hoggan and Associates. and that's one of Canada's leading communications firms. Jim is also founder of the influential climate website Desmog Blog, and he's working on a new book, which I would recommend to everyone, called The Polluted Public Sphere. Next up, we'll have Keith Gillard, and he's one of Vancouver's most experienced clean tech and advanced materials investors. So he's previously worked with the Mitsubishi Corporation and with BASF Venture Capital America in Silicon Valley. And he's currently a general partner at Pangaea Ventures in Vancouver. After him, we'll have Christy Stevenson, who works with NEI Investments, and they're one of Canada's leaders in socially responsible investing. So through her work, she really does bust the myth that green and profitable are somehow in competition. And finally, we have Carleen Thomas, and she's a former elected councillor for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, who is now a project manager for its Sacred Trust initiative, which is an effort to stop Kinder Morgan's oil sands pipeline expansion. So without further ado, Jim, do you want to start?
So thank you, everyone, for coming out to listen to us tonight, and thanks to Ashley and Jeff for encouraging us to come out and share our thoughts with you, and particularly for encouraging me to maybe do it in a little bit more positive way than I normally talk about some of these things. I have to start by saying that anything that I'm saying tonight, I'm saying as the author of this new book, The Polluted Public Square, not as chair of the David Suzuki Foundation. So when I picture climate change in the future, what do I see? I thought about this and I thought, wow, there's actually potentially a positive outcome to climate change, in that as it makes its way into our communities and into our personal lives, it may actually force us to disagree more constructively and learn how to work with people whose views we don't like and we don't necessarily agree with or respect. I think it's possible that we could end up becoming more civil because we have to, more civil in public discourse. I don't know if you've heard of Deborah Tannen, the great American social scientist, but she might put it like this: we become less likely to shout, ignore, ridicule, or otherwise undermine the facts and arguments that support the other side. Opposition becomes more genuine and fair-minded. The quality of our outrage increases. We learn that there's a difference between legitimate public arguments that help us get to the bottom of things and public arguments that are designed to crush and steamroll opposition at any cost, and the public square becomes less polluted. So I'm actually optimistic about this because of the people that I've met and interviewed for my book. I've interviewed some of the world's leading public intellectuals about the state of public discourse. I had tea in the House of Lords dining room with Baroness O'Neill, who's an expert on public trust. I spent time with Harvard's Marshall Gantz, the guy who developed the Obama ground game election strategy in both Obama elections. I interviewed MIT's experts on transformative change, Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer. I even traveled to the Himalayas and interviewed the Dalai Lama. And I asked them all this question: why, despite all the scientific evidence and concerns from experts in atmospheric, marine, and life sciences, are we doing so little to fix these big environmental problems we face, like climate change? Why isn't public discourse on the environment more data-driven? Or as Columbia's Eric Johnson put it to me, why are we listening to each other shout rather than listening to what the evidence is trying to tell us? One of my first interviews was with a guy from Yale Law School. He's a cognitive scientist, and his name is Dan Kahan. And he answered the question like this: just as you can pollute the natural environment, you can pollute public conversations. And he went on to say that healthy public discourse is a public good that we should all be working a lot harder to value and protect. Now, for most of you, I don't have to tell you that that doesn't seem to be the way things are going in Canada these days. In 2010, Canada's oil and gas industry launched a PR campaign with this message: ethical oil is like fair trade coffee or conflict-free diamonds. It's morally superior. In 2012, the oil and gas industry joined hands with the Conservative government on a campaign to convince Canadians that British Columbians who oppose oil sands pipelines and tankers on our coast are extremists working for American business interests. On the other side of things, environmental activists have done their fair share of polluting the public square as well, comparing oil sands to heroin or calling it blood oil. They've called oil companies environmental criminals, engaged in crimes against humanity. Now, you wouldn't think that this level of political rhetoric could actually increase, but it did. Senator Mike Duffy called these BC environmental charities un-Canadian. The Minister of the Environment at that time accused them of money laundering. The PMO called them foreign-funded radicals. Senator Don Platt said, where would environmentalists draw the line on who they receive money from? Would they take money from Al-Qaeda, Hamas, the Taliban? Now, I'll get through this negative part quickly. I was just in Calgary at the last Neil Young concert. Best concert I ever saw in my life. Amazing experience. Anyway, the first question came from the editorial page editor of the Calgary Herald, something along the lines of, do you fly in private jets? And her name was Licia Corbella. She wrote this about the Neil Young press conference. Oh, his talk is righteous, all right. His walk, however, remains an abomination. In other words, for Neil Young and other hawkers of hypocrisy like him, he chooses his own comfort over his convictions. If he truly believed that human-created CO2 causes catastrophic global warming, he wouldn't even so much look at a private jet, let alone climb on board. So, Jason Stanley writes for the New York Times. He teaches philosophy of language and a class in democracy and propaganda at Yale, not Yale Law School, but at Yale University. And he told me this: when oil from Fort McMurray is called ethical oil, or coal from West Virginia is called clean coal, it's difficult to have a real discussion about the pros and cons. He explained that these kinds of improbable assertions, where you misappropriate words and the meanings get twisted, are not so much about making substantive claims as they are about silencing. He called them linguistic strategies for stealing the voices of others. Now, according to Jason Stanley, Fox News engages in silencing when it describes itself as fair and balanced. When to an audience that's perfectly aware that it's neither. The effect is to suggest there's no such thing as fair and balanced. There's no possibility of balanced news, only propaganda. So I believe that Canada's public square is polluted with a toxic form of rhetoric that insinuates there are no facts, there is no objectivity, and everyone is just trying to manipulate you for their own interests. And so when everything is mislabeled and you can't trust what anyone says, why would you bother with the public square? American Deborah Tannen put it this way: when you hear a ruckus outside your house, you open the window to see what's going on. But if there's a ruckus every night, you close the shutters and ignore it. So the energy environment rhetoric in Canada has made us less able to weigh facts honestly, disagree constructively, and think things through collectively. So how you actually clean up the public square is like a big conversation that would probably be somewhere around 100,000 words in the book, and we're just scratching the surface of it. But let me say this: I'm right, you're wrong, let me tell you what you should think is not a great communication strategy. Moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt told me that, and he also said it doesn't work because we all think we're right. He says that people are divided by politics and religion not because some people are good and others are evil, but because our minds were designed for groupish righteousness. According to Jonathan Haidt, morality both binds and blinds us. Our righteous minds were designed by evolution to unite us into teams, divide us against other teams, and blind us to the truth. He suggests that we step outside the self-righteousness of our moral matrix and look to the Dalai Lama to see the power of moral humility, and that we take the time to understand the values and the worldviews of people we strongly disagree with. I interviewed Karen Armstrong, who won the 2008 TED Prize, developed the Charter for Compassion with her prize. And she put it in another way: we must speak out against injustice, but not in a way that causes more hatred. She told me, remember what St. Paul said: charity takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others. So my time's up, but I just want to say one last thing. David Suzuki and I had this great honor to spend an afternoon with Thich Nhat Hanh when he was in Vancouver. He's a Zen Buddhist monk, very famous for those of you who don't follow Buddhism. Very special man. At the end of this conversation that we had, I asked Thich Nhat Hanh about activism, the role of activism. And I was making this argument that it's important that people expect the David Suzuki Foundation to speak out in Canada on behalf of the environment. And you're not saying that we shouldn't be doing that, are you? I said to him. And he looked at me, and I don't know if you've ever seen him, but he has this way of looking at you that is kind of like not looking at you, but looking like into you, through you, and I don't even know how to put it into words, but it's a very powerful look. And he just kind of quietly looked at me and he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. So as climate change twists our arm, I think we will all learn the meaning of this Zen koan from Thich Nhat Hanh. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith. I'm with Pangaea Ventures. I was asked to talk a little bit differently than how I would normally address things. I'm come out of the venture capital industry, and I've always been focused on clean tech, but what we're used to talking about are problems and possible solutions. But this time I was asked to talk about, imagine that all of these problems in clean tech, all the climate problems, environmental problems, energy problems, that they've been solved. And then describe the future. So I'm going to try to do that from the perspective of our business, and also give you some ideas on current things that are going on that are going to lead us there. So just 1 minute on my business. Our special focus is advanced materials. So we do the physical sciences, chemistry, biology, material science, etc. And we're really focused on opportunities that are very capital efficient and that can make a difference today. And we've invested across this sort of landscape. And in my slides here tonight, I'm going to walk you around the circle. We're going to start in energy, which overlaps into electronics, it overlaps into health, it overlaps in sustainability, and we're going to end up right where we started again. So, what does the future look like? Well, hopefully not like WALL-E here, but maybe something more like this. Let's talk about energy. This is a real proposal from an architecture firm right now in San Francisco. They're looking to drill down geothermal vents and then coming up to the top of the hills here, just to the south of the city, to make a maximum difference between the cold air, which is famous with the fog there, and of course the hot magma deep under the earth, to capture energy in the difference there. And in the background, you see those strange spindly shapes there. Those are, let's say, architecturally pleasing and bird-safe windmills. This is a real proposal today, and we may see things like this coming into the future. Now, the bad news for many people here, and some people in the province, of course, consider this good news, is that the energy mix of the future is almost certainly going to include natural gas. Natural gas is cheap forever, and we aren't going to run out of it, not in any of our lifetimes. You won't be able to stop people from using it. There are problems with it today. I'm not going to talk about the problems, but there are also solutions coming to these problems right now. So I'm actually very bullish on the future of natural gas. And part of that will be driving a hydrogen economy, not a true hydrogen economy the way it was imagined in the 80s and 90s, but still, there's no cheaper way to get your hydrogen than to take it out of natural gas. But that won't be all of it, of course. Now, if you look to the predictions of what's coming in from, say, the DOE or from the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency, on the predictions on the penetration of solar and other renewables, and actually going forward, I looked forward 50 years, which is about as far as these predictions go. It's still just a tiny bit, like some say 11% of the world's energy generation. So for me to imagine the future, I had to go further. But I actually think it may come faster than that. We're looking right now at a technology called rectennas. Rectenna is probably something that's not on your radar screen. Rectenna is a rectifying antenna. Word smashed together there. And this is a technology that could replace the current solar technologies that we see today. It's already been demonstrated at a 90% efficiency. Now you compare that to 19% efficiency you typically have with a silicon solar. The idea that 9/10 of the energy coming out of the sun could be harvested in useful electrons and only 1/10 lost to heat, that is a very, very exciting future. Moreover, we're already looking right now at a company that has a roll-to-roll printing technology that'll be able to just stamp these things out in huge sheets. They're not quite there yet, but they're only a few years off. So even imagining multiple delays on this, and I project forward 50 years or so, it's hard for me to imagine that this rectenna or some other similar technology won't be everywhere. And it'll look a lot nicer than this silicon solar as well. Much cheaper, much higher efficiency. Even on a typical Vancouver winter day, you could get meaningful electricity out of it. Efficiency will also play a role, but the bad news is that when energy is cheap, and with rectennas, we're probably going to be looking at 1 cent per kilowatt hour, a lot cheaper than anybody has electricity right now. The problem is when energy is cheap, people are not efficient. Canada is one of the most inefficient, energy inefficient countries in the world. Us and Russia and Saudi Arabia, we're terrible because we're rich with energy and it's so cheap, but we just throw it away. However, that is changing. You know, one of our local investments here, a company in Burnaby called Switch Materials, they've developed a smart window film, a film that automatically darkens when the sun hits it, but can be instantly bleached to a transparent setting just with a momentary pulse of less than 1 volt. Very, very low energy to change the states of it. This stuff is organic chemistry, which means cheap, easy to manufacture. And technologies like this, I think, are really going to reduce the energy load that each of us requires every day. You know, buildings consume 30% of all generated electricity. If we can reduce that by an order of magnitude, it's possible, really going to lighten the load in terms of generation. But that's not the whole story. We also need to be able to store electricity. We like to, whether we like to drive or not, we do get around, maybe not in private jets, but maybe on a train or something. We need some way to store this energy, especially if we're getting it from intermittent sources like wind. There's tremendous progress being made here. Another one of our portfolio companies is Envia. They're the world record holder on energy density. It's over 400 watt hours per kilogram. That's triple what a typical lithium-ion battery is. And this progress is not stopping. So if I am looking forward decades into the future, it becomes easy for me to imagine cheap and very effective energy storage. Hydrogen will be part of that too. Of course, this also, as we saw earlier, this spills over into electronics, which are going to actually, maybe it's not as obvious about how that fits into climate change, but it is going to affect our lives in a big way. Well, maybe not this big, but maybe in more insidious ways. Now, if you this image is going around the last week or so, and if you check out Snopes, you'll see this has nothing to do with putting the number on the beast on every baby who's born in Europe. Nothing to do with that. This is a real company called MC10. They have a printed electronics technology which can be put on these temporary tattoos. Now, some of the uses for this would be monitoring your temperature, monitoring your blood glucose, your blood pressure, etc. But this is today. If I look forward decades from now, actually the picture would be much more boring. You'd just be looking at skin. Really, it's going to be internal. Electronics, we all have our gadgets. You know, most of the people, maybe some of us don't have a phone with us, but most of the people in the room have a phone. And we're so gadget-oriented today. Here I am standing in front of a gadget. They'll all be gone. You won't see them anymore. And that will be an efficiency improvement too. There'll be less heat generated from that. We'll use less materials to make them. It's a great thing about printed electronics. You're really only using the exact amount of material you need to put down the metals and the polymers that are used to make this. You're not starting with a huge piece of silicon and then using very corrosive acids and solvents to etch away layers on that, which is actually very, very nasty chemistry that goes on there. This is going to enable sensors to be everywhere, and that has some privacy nightmares to it. But let's not talk about that tonight. Sensors, both external and internal, are going to help us to monitor our health, and not just our own health, but the health of the world outside of us. This gets me into the third circle. I'm talking about health here. Right now, we're already looking at technologies that can monitor agriculture at a scale, at a fine scale that's never before been imagined, for exact watering of crops, for watching for pests, for other weather problems that may occur. And agriculture is something that I'm quite interested in. It's a very urgent issue, and addressing that. Maybe the future of agriculture doesn't quite look like this until we're, on Pandora or something. But this is actually a real this is a real farm vehicle right now that's sold by this company, Valero? No, not Valero. Thank you, Valtra, yeah. So this is actually, this is a real thing. I could have used a photograph, but I thought, let's get way out there, the sci-fi. So it's only the background that's sci-fi. That's a real thing they call the ant, and it's something they're selling into the agriculture market right now. The real future of agriculture looks something like this. It's not so exciting. It really won't look that much different than what we have today, but it will be fundamentally different. Already today, I'm the chairman of a company called Vesteron. Vesteron discovered compounds in spider venom. Yeah, it's cool. It's really cool. Imagine nobody had ever thought that spider venom, it evolved for the killing of insects. And nobody ever thought to apply that commercially until Vesteron. So these are compounds that have no, I'm not talking low toxic, but no measurable toxic effects to any mammals, birds, fish, or bees. Even marine invertebrates, but really the bees are the thing that people are hung up on right now. We can make the stuff cheaply. It's very effective at controlling those nasty leaf-chewing insects, mostly caterpillars and beetles, that farmers are most upset about. And that's responsible for 30% of crop losses. So that means 30% of all the land that's used to grow crops right now is really just being used to feed insects, which cause more problems later. And we know David Suzuki has a soft spot for insects. But these insects, we're not looking to wipe them out entirely. We're just looking to control them so that we can have very effective, safe crops, things where we don't have damaging chemicals. People can walk right out into the field as these things are being sprayed without fear. The farmer could spray and harvest the same day if they thought that was the reasonable thing to do. We've made a second investment in this space as well. All plants on Earth, from the smallest seed to the tallest tree, are crawling with microbacteria. People always thought that they were parasites until the 90s when the first scientists thought to, first of all, remove them, which is really hard, by the way, very hardy. And then the seeds wouldn't sprout, and the plant died. But then he put them back on, and the seed sprouted, and the plant came back to life. Nobody realized that plants and these little bacteria had co-evolved together and cannot exist without each other. Well, this another company that I'm on the board of, one of our investments, is called New Leaf, and they have shown that if you inoculate a seed with a high population of these bacteria, it would normally have, I don't know, a few 100,000 or something on it. You give it a few million to start its life, it sprouts faster, it sprouts stronger, it produces a lot more crop in the same land. And this is the stuff, we all eat these every day, and we have since the beginning of time. It's as safe and as proven as anything could ever be. And these biologicals, I think, are going to play an increasing role going forward. And that really takes us into the fourth quadrant, which is sustainability. This, again, is our real architectural submission to the city of New York right now. And I've got the font is so dark, I'm sorry, that I can't read you the name of the firm. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Of course, it's completely ridiculous. It would be twice as tall as the biggest building there, and I don't really know how sustainable it is, but it's a cool image. What the real future of sustainability looks like is this. That's pond scum. It's algae. Algae and other microbes really are the future. I mean, we're realizing how important they are to our own bodies. I just described to you how important they are to the life of plants. We're finding now that these things are already engineered by nature to make all kinds of amazing things. Algae already makes a huge percentage of its body weight in an oil, which is very similar to fuels that we use today. They can make chemicals. I've looked at a company that has coaxed algae into making pure sugar, and it doesn't eat the sugar. It literally takes in CO2 and sunlight just like any other plant, and it makes sugar. Well, it sounds incredible until you start to think about an apple tree or a pineapple. I mean, that's what they do too. But we can do this in a pure way, which of course means a low-cost way, because separating out the impurities is a lot of the cost. There are other things going on here, desalination and the removal of other contaminants in water. We're seeing microbial approaches here, also electrochemical approaches, which are very low cost. I'm looking at one right now, which is about 5 times less energy to desalinate water than anything I've ever seen before. So breakthroughs are happening now. I think we are moving into a future where water, where basic resources, commodities, which currently we depend on petrochemicals for, are going to be manufacturable or we're able to purify them in a more natural and completely sustainable way. We recently just made our most recent investment into a company called Callista. Callista is using microorganisms called methanotrophs. Methanotrophs eat methane, and we can use these organisms now to make a lot of chemicals and even animal feed. That will probably be the first product. And what do we use? Well, natural gas. We feed them natural gas, which, as I said earlier, is permanently cheap and doesn't compete with food at all. And we can make food out of it. We can make fuel out of it. We can make chemicals out of it, which really brings me back to where I started at the beginning, going back into the energy cycle. So when I think to what the future will look like after we solve these issues, and I hope I've inspired you or provoked you to see that there is reason to hope that these issues are being addressed right now. Some of them will take longer than others, but I think we're looking to really a better, cleaner, more enjoyable life, and hopefully a more peaceful one as well. Anyway, I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
So the good thing about going third is I think by now we've all established that everybody here wants to talk about climate change. You're not mixed up that this is the play downstairs on Chicoutimi. So that's good. So I have the uncoolest image ever, but that's sort of on purpose. Thanks very much. I chose this image, actually, because I think it is the most widely shared cultural assumption, and the event was being billed as climate change and culture in business. The notion that over time, the market goes up. Everybody sort of agrees to that. And of course, what that means that sort of technically is that in aggregate, the shares trading on a given exchange are going up. But in other words, we have really quite a shared collective cultural assumption that over time, all the business activity that this line represents means that things are getting better. I'm just going to watch myself on the time here. Are getting better for shareholders. And what we don't have, interestingly, is any kind of shared cultural assumption about how other stakeholders are faring, stakeholders of companies over that same time horizon. Does all that business activity mean that things are getting better for employees, for communities, for climate change, for other environmental issues? And I think there you're getting a huge range of views, depending on what the issue is and who you're talking to, and maybe even the time frame. I work for NEI Investments. I'm the manager of environmental, social, and governance evaluations and research there. And NEI is a mutual fund company, Canadian-owned mutual fund company. We consider ourselves a social enterprise fundamentally because we're owned by the credit union system through Desjardins and the credit union centrals across Canada. And Jeff asked if this was the only image I was going to use. I don't know. It's always hard to know on email what the tone is. I wasn't sure if he thought that was fine or if it was a bit suspect. But I did put it up as the only image I've got today because when I think about future success, as Jeff sort of positioned it, and the role that socially responsible investing has to play vis-a-vis climate change and getting us there, it is really about getting all that business activity represented by that line to be better for stakeholders broadly. We're investors, and obviously we think of ourselves as an important stakeholder, but we're certainly not the only stakeholder. So when we look at the future and we imagine, all the work that we do in socially responsible investing and where could it take us as a society and as a business community, really, there's a few pieces to it in terms of the future. The future would be, if we were successful, that all investing generates both value, so the investor return that we all have come to expect, and also reflects values. That markets are not neutral. I mean, not that they ever have been or non-political, but that they in fact are representing our collective values. And this is really both from the point of view of environmental and other related considerations being embedded in investment analysis, but also from the point of view that everyone using their investor power or uses their investor power really as a leverage point in solving and not in exasperating issues like climate change. In addition, so the future is also one for us that in which that relentless short-term pressures of quarterly investor cycles have given way to capital markets that reward addressing serious problems like climate change, which are longer term in nature. Materiality is a huge talking point constantly in our business, and the reality is that is always shifting. The definition of materiality is always shifting depending on the time horizon. So if in the context of climate change, you're looking at something like unburnable carbon or the so-called carbon bubble, that's an idea that is not hugely material to a day trader. But if you're a pension fund, all of a sudden, this becomes a pretty serious issue. The notion that you can't burn all the carbon and all the reserves on the planet, and yet you still have a very healthy exploration industry. So where does that take you? So the other piece, which is quite connected to this, is the idea of sort of incentivizing not only markets based on the time horizon, but also incentivizing corporate leaders. So actually rewarding corporate leaders to do the right things and the things that we collectively would like to see, and helping reward them to do the things that would move the agenda forward on issues like climate change. So incentivizing them, instead of incentivizing them primarily, or in some cases exclusively, to drive up share price, in the sort of shareholder primacy model, instead incentivizing them to create benefit for a range of stakeholders, corporate stakeholders and public stakeholders, and to compensate them on metrics related to things like environmental performance. And you do see that in small measure in the capital markets, but certainly not enough. It's very clear that there are internal corporate champions at companies that are deeply concerned about many of these issues and are very committed, in fact, to moving them forward. But they face this enormous struggle that they can't make the case, on the quarterly call that it's pushing up the share price, in the next 90 days. And then finally, the future would be one where SRI has helped companies to accelerate into their energy transition through the full set of activities available to SRI. So within socially responsible investing, we have a number of strategies. NEI is an example of one of the players that kind of we like to think that we use them all. So we invest in certain companies that meet baseline expectations around environmental and other issues. We divest from those that don't or that go down a path that we're not comfortable with. We spend an enormous amount of time engaging with companies on environmental, social, and governance issues. And then we also feel like there's a lot of companies that aren't in our portfolio, and yet we want a say in essentially in what the standards are for them too. So when we're engaging with companies, we feel that's a very powerful tool, but at the same time, it is ultimately voluntary. Our only opportunity would be to ultimately divest if they don't do what we like. So we would like to create a regime where companies are really required, not just taking things on voluntarily, because it can be lonely making the investor case for some long-term environmental issues and other related issues. So we do a lot of public policy work. And the one thing about investors is they are recognized as an important player, and having investors through in the public policy realm advocating for things like addressing climate change issues, and moving towards transition and getting a fair price on carbon and all these kinds of things is also enormously helpful. So the world for us would be that all investors were essentially SRI investors, or maybe it would be that none were SRI investors, because it would just be a given that what everyone would do, they would be using their money. We're all investors at minimum through CPP or something like that, but we would all be leveraging social change and environmental change through our investments. And then just finally, the enormity of climate change as a problem is obviously hard to overstate, and the downside to facing a big problem is self-evident. But if there can be any upside to a big problem, is that it sometimes makes way for pretty big solutions, because they're suddenly possible or even necessary. And we just think that investors should be part of that solution. All of us as investors, and the capital markets should be ours to be making that line go up for all stakeholders and for the environment.
Ossiam Nitsiaya, I Tanishqualoan, Quitsi Quitsnala Ihui, Anta Ansachalot, Anta Mana Synthalia Eat Siakmak Slahot Siam, Anta Emith Quathan Sachalot, Quaslahot Siam, Hyde Sepka, Meet Sep Hotwilam, to Hamathquiam, E Schohotmish, E Slawa Tothwelmuch. My dear relatives and friends, the feelings I have inside are really good to see you here this evening. And in Coast Salish way, I shared my ancestral name with you. I introduced myself to you by my ancestral name. I am Ansachalot. And in Coast Salish way, I shared with you my parents and my grandparents. My parents are Ernie and Deanna George, and my grandparents are the late hereditary chief, the Right Honorable John L. George, and the late Lillian Dolly George. And on behalf of my friends and relatives of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh welcome you here to our homelands and waters. And I'd like to thank Ashley and the organizers for inviting me here to share our story with you this evening. I was feeling kind of unnerved because what I'm going to share with you is just so different. So I really appreciate the diversity of this evening and hope that what I share with you kind of fits in with what is happening here tonight. As I shared my name, I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Tsleil-Waututh in our language means people of the inlet, and it refers directly to the Burrard Inlet, the Indian Arm, and the Indian River. Our people have been on these lands and waters since time immemorial. About a year and a half ago, my cousin Reuben George came to Chief and Council at the time and shared all the information that he had about this potential project that was coming up, the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline owned by Kinder Morgan. And so he kind of whipped us up into, we kind of got really uptight about it and really worried, like, do we need to do stuff now? And what we did was we brought this information to our community. We had a dinner, We presented them with the pros and cons of an expansion like this and the impact it would have on the Tsleil-Waututh people. And by the end of the evening, it was a resounding no. We have to stop this expansion. Out of that was born the Sacred Trust Initiative. In the Straits Halkomelem, which is around the Victoria area, a really good friend of ours shared a word with my sister, Leah George Wilson, and the word is shahalmas. Shahalmas in the language means sacred obligation. We couldn't use that word because that's not our word to use. So we came up with the word sacred trust. So I work for the Sacred Trust Initiative of the Tsleil-Waututh people. And we started out with a team of 4. We're down to a team of 2. And part of my job is, as project manager, is to reach out to the First Nations along the pipeline. So my thoughtless and I traveled the pipeline over the last 6-7 months, visiting as many of the First Nations communities that will be directly impacted by that expansion, and just sharing our story and sharing the knowledge, the research that we have discovered over the last year and a bit. What's important about how Tsleil-Waututh does business and how we face development and face expansions of, the city around us is that we try and be as inclusive and be participating as much as we can. As I said, we have this sacred obligation, we have this sacred trust to protect the lands and waters of Tsleil-Waututh. But it's not just for us in the here and now. It is for our future generations. Dave and I became grandparents for the first time almost 3 years ago now. And we have 4 beautiful granddaughters. And when I became a grandmother, all those teachings that I learned from my grandmothers just came flooding over me. I didn't realize how much I had learned or how much knowledge my grandmothers had shared with me. And by the time the 3rd granddaughter came along, because she's the daughter of our only daughter, I went, holy crap, this is a lot of responsibility. How am I going to be the grandmother that my grandmothers were to me? And we've heard it before this evening, is you just have to understand what your truth is. Our grandmothers always taught us, no one can ever take away your truth. So when Tsleil-Waututh goes out into the world, we have nothing but our truth to share. And people need to find a way to fit in with that. Maybe that's what you call sustainability, I don't know. We do everything we can, our economic development, we're as green as we can be. We've invested into wind power with, the company just went out of my head. I've just learned recently that we'll be installing solar panels on a couple of our public buildings. I believe it's our little school, that we have a little school that is an alternate school, and our family center, which houses a infant toddler daycare and daycare for babies. I just wanted you to understand that we're not all about stopping development or making money or anything, but it's really important that we do it in a sustainable way. And sustainable might be different to different groups of people, but sustainable to us as Hwalmo people, as First Nation people, is ensuring that there's going to be something left for those generations to come, for our granddaughters. I also heard the word tonight about being hopeful. Are we hopeful? I have no choice but to be hopeful because of those 4 beautiful granddaughters that we have. I need to ensure I leave space, or I create space for them, so that, 50 years from now, they're not standing here in front of a group of people saying, we need to do this. We need to work together. We need to protect our lands and waters. It's a really huge concept about protecting land and waters, and I kind of use it just glibly, it seems like sometimes, but we all are connected. That's what connects all us human beings together with those living beings as well, is clean water and clean air. And that's a sacred trust. That's a sacred obligation that we all carry. And we hope that working on this project, stopping this expansion, brings our communities together. Because any kind of accident that will happen from a pipeline or from a tanker or even at the facilities has an impact on all of us. It might not impact you right now, but it has that ripple effect. Somewhere down the line, it will impact you. We had an event last April at the Wall Center, and it was a really amazing event. We brought a lot of panelists together that were thinking about the impact of these types of projects in an economical way, in an environmental way, in a community way, and it was really good. And I think that one of our leaders at that time had jokingly said, or I hope it was kind of sarcastically, we have to thank Harper for bringing us together like this. Because as colonial governments work, they divide, they use that rule, divide and rule. And sitting at my grandfather's table, he would tell me that. We'd be looking out over the inlet to see the refineries and the tankers going by, and he'd say, we have to find a way to coexist because they're not going anywhere and we're not going anywhere. So hopefully we can come together and become a united front because we're protecting our province for a reason that's relevant to us. For some, it might be protecting their investments, their property. They've invested in property. That's important. For some, it's protecting, the fish-bearing streams because they bring their grandchildren there every summer to go fishing. It's all about finding our way to be connected to the time and place that we are in. And that's not just a First Nations worldview. I believe that's a worldview of any human being. I was just writing down little things that were coming to my mind while I was sitting listening to the other speakers, and one of our mantras or slogans, I don't know what you would call it, one of our teachings that have been passed on to us is, because we live on the north shore of the Burrard Inlet, we're always taught when the tide went out, the table was set. So our people could sustain themselves on that Burrard Inlet, harvesting the clams, the oysters, the mussels, different types of cod, different types of sea plant life that no longer exists. We can no longer harvest the shellfish. The crab We can still harvest, but they're pretty, my uncle was saying they're really soft shells, and my other cousin was saying they taste like nothing, so she won't go and harvest anymore. In my short lifetime, we've gone from being a bountiful inlet to an inlet that I don't step on the shores anymore because it's just too polluted. My children have spent a little bit of time on the inlet, but not, in our day. We were down there practically every day during the summers. In my dad's time, it was the same. In my grandparents' time, they would all go down there to harvest the clams and oysters, and my would have her sons build a big pit, dig a pit. They'd throw stones in there and a fire and heat them up. When everybody would come back to shore with their sacks of clams, she'd throw them onto the hot stones and cover them with kelp, and there would be lunch. In my grandmother's time, that was my great-grandmother's time. In my grandmother's time, they used flour sacks to cover the clams because by then the kelp was already, it wasn't as growing as huge as it did in my us time. In my time, we never got to do that because by that time my parents had to move into the wage economy, and we were left on our own, and we'd just go down the beach, spend the day. I remember as a kid experiencing red tide, and our parents would tell us, "Oh, we can't go swimming, it's red tide." And we're like, "Well, what's red tide?" And my dad explained. He just said, "Oh, it's just the inlet's way of cleansing herself." I went, "Oh, that's really cool." So in my lifetime, maybe once a summer that was happening. As a young adult and mother, I noticed the red tide coming more and more. So in my way of thinking and teaching our children is, if we just give space to Mother Earth, she can heal herself, and she can maintain and sustain all the living beings. And I don't mean that in a real, it's sincere. That's how a lot of First Nations people feel, even in this day and age. Even though we drive cars and we fly in planes, that's just the way of life, but we still have to have that respect and that integrity to take care of where we are. Just take what we need. That's what they always taught us. Take what we need and give back. This picture was taken, I believe, in October. Was it October? When we started our journey of the Sacred Trust Initiative, we have some really powerful leaders in our little community, and our leaders have always had a really good balance of being modern, but holding on to the spiritual ways of our people. So for the last decade or so, we have ceremony 3 times a year. We've added a water ceremony, and that was something I have never experienced before. And what we did was last summer, we had a canoe journey from Ambleside Beach in West Vancouver to Kate's Park to Huayawichin toward Deep Cove. And we had a number of spiritual leaders on the canoes, and on their journey to Huayawichin, Kinder Morgan's Westridge Terminal is just south on the south shore of Burrard Inlet. And what they did was they held a ceremony out in front of the facilities at Westridge. So in October, we had another canoe journey, and we had friends and relatives from the Greenpeace organization join us, and we had friends and relatives from the Squamish and the Musqueam join us as well. And we did the exact same ceremony there. But because Greenpeace was part of our journey, I'm telling you, they had 2 helicopters circling over top of us that whole entire time. And I really appreciate the elders that we had with us. they just shrugged it off. It didn't mean anything to them, but it was really upsetting to me because it was almost like they were trying to paint a sinister picture on what we were doing, and all we were doing was practicing our right and our sacred obligation to protect our inlet. One of my aunties said, I used to work in the Burnaby School District, and she came to speak to one of our Aboriginal circles at the high school, and she said, when you stop talking, when you have nothing more to say, it just means you've said all that you need to say. Thank you for listening.